October 31st, 1988 was supposed to be the end of my story. I was an 18-year-old kid, trapped in a body and mind I hated, convinced that a garage filled with carbon monoxide was my only escape. But what happened next was not the silence I expected. Instead of oblivion, I found myself floating above my own lifeless body, staring down at a scene of unimaginable horror. That's when the descent began, not into peace, but into a darkness that had its own light, its own terrifying choices. I was given a choice: stay here at the gates of hell until Judgment Day, or return to this life in a painful and disfigured form. I chose life, and with it a sickness that would save me from myself. What would you have chosen?
My obsession was a beast that gnawed at my self-worth every single day. It wasn't just about a few blemishes. It was about the fundamental belief that my body was a prison and my reflection a monster I couldn't escape. Before that day, before the car and the silence, there was just me, a boy named Jacob, living in a quiet, unassuming town, in a world that felt both too big and too small all at once. I was just a kid, a teenager navigating the awkward, turbulent years of high school. I wasn't an outcast, but I wasn't the captain of the football team either. I was somewhere in the middle, a face in the crowd trying to find my place. My days were a monotonous rhythm of classes, homework, and a part-time job bagging groceries at the local supermarket. It was a simple, predictable life, the kind that many people would probably call normal. But for me, it was a cage. From the outside, you might have seen a typical lanky teenager with a shy smile, but on the inside, a silent war raged. It all started when I was 15, a strange psychological affliction that doctors couldn't seem to name or understand. It was an overwhelming obsession with my complexion. Today, they call it dermatillomania, but back then it was just a secret torment. Every day, I would spend hours in front of the mirror, convinced that a single blemish was a catastrophic flaw. This wasn't just vanity. It was a consuming, pathological need to fix something that wasn't broken. My skin became a battleground, and I was my own worst enemy. The shame was a heavy blanket I carried everywhere, a constant fear that someone would see the flaws I was so desperate to hide. This obsession bled into every aspect of my life. I avoided social gatherings, skipping parties and dates, because the thought of someone seeing me up close was unbearable. My world shrunk to the confines of my bedroom and the merciless reflection in the mirror. My childhood wasn't marked by a singular trauma, but by a series of small, gnawing disappointments. I remember one summer day, probably around age 10, trying to build a treehouse with my dad. I was so clumsy, so uncoordinated. I'd drop the hammer, miss the nail, and feel my dad's quiet disappointment. He wasn't angry, but that silence, that gentle sigh, was worse. It made me feel like I was fundamentally broken, unable to even do something as simple as build a treehouse. That feeling of not being good enough, of being a constant letdown, followed me into my teenage years and merged with my obsession. It wasn't just about my skin anymore. It was about the feeling that I was a defective product, a flawed design.
My emotional state was a constant low hum of anxiety and quiet despair. There were moments of genuine joy, of course. I loved listening to music, losing myself in the melodies of bands like The Cure or Depeche Mode. Those songs were a kind of escape, a brief respite from the relentless self-criticism. I also found solace in drawing and sketching, creating worlds on paper where I was in control, where everything was perfect. But these moments were fleeting. the dark cloud of my obsession was always there, waiting to descend. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, a feeling that no one could possibly understand the torment I was going through. I felt disconnected from my friends, from my family, from the entire world. Life was just a series of days to be endured, a countdown to a finale I couldn't quite imagine. As for my beliefs about life and death, I was, to be honest, completely apathetic. I was raised in a Christian household, went to church on Sundays, and knew the stories of the Bible, but it was all just a routine, a set of rules I followed without any real conviction. I wasn't a deeply spiritual person. The concepts of heaven and hell felt abstract, like fairy tales. Death was simply the end, a final quietus. I didn't believe in an afterlife. I just believed that when you were gone, you were gone. This complete lack of belief made my decision that October day seem so simple. There was nothing to fear, nothing to lose. I was just ending the suffering, closing the book on a story I couldn't stand to read anymore. Little did I know, the next chapter was already being written, and it would be more real than anything I had ever experienced.
The world outside my window looked perfectly normal, almost painfully so. The autumn leaves were bright, the sun was shining, and I remember thinking how beautiful everything was as I was preparing to leave it all behind. October 31st, 1988 began like any other day. The sun rose, casting long golden shadows across my bedroom floor. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of Halloween. But for me, it was just another Monday, a day to be endured. I went through the motions of my morning routine, a familiar, hollow ritual. I had breakfast with my family, but I don't remember what we talked about. I was already gone. My mind was a million miles away, meticulously planning the final act of a play I'd been writing for years. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was a carefully calculated one, born from years of quiet desperation. There was a strange sense of calm that day, an eerie tranquility that settled over me. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet before the final curtain call. There were no premonitions, no flashes of insight, no sense of impending doom. It was just a regular day, which in a way made it all the more terrifying. The world was oblivious to the fact that my life was about to end, and that disconnect was a strange kind of peace. It was a day of finalities, of small, insignificant moments that took on a profound weight. I remember the feel of the cool tile under my feet, the sound of my mom's voice calling my name, the way the light hit the kitchen table. These were the last normal things I would experience. After a few hours of pacing, I grabbed the car keys and walked out to the garage. The air was heavy and smelled of oil and concrete. It was a familiar smell, but today it was different. It smelled of finality. I got into my car, a battered old sedan that had been my only real escape, and drove it into the garage. The door rumbled shut behind me, sealing me in. The sound was a loud, heavy thud, a final punctuation mark on my life. I remember feeling a bizarre sense of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders. The fight was over. The years of anxiety, the hours spent in front of the mirror, the 2 previous failed attempts, it was all coming to an end. I lay down in the back seat, curled up into a ball, and waited for the carbon monoxide to do its work. I had done my research. I knew what to expect. A gradual drifting off, a painless fade to black. I was tired, so deeply tired. I closed my eyes and let my mind wander. I thought about my family, my friends, the life I was throwing away. There was no regret, only a sense of resignation. The world was too much, and I was too little.
As the fumes started to fill the car, I felt a strange, detached sensation. It wasn't pain or fear, but a slow, creeping numbness. My body began to feel heavy, as if it was sinking into the seat. My mind, however, felt clearer than it had in years. It was as if all the noise, all the anxiety was finally starting to fade. I could hear my own breathing, slow and steady, a sound that would soon be gone forever. My vision started to blur, and the world outside the car window began to fade. This was it. This was the end. I was finally free.
The voices were a million screams crying out in agony, and the smell was pure rot. And then he gave me a choice: stay here until judgment, or return to a life of unimaginable pain and disfigurement. I knew which I had to choose, but the feeling of what I was choosing was the most sickening thing I have ever known. The final moments in the car were a strange mix of physical sensations and a profound mental clarity. The suffocating weight of the carbon monoxide began to press in on my chest, my body growing heavier, more lethargic, my vision blurred, and the world dissolved into a hazy, muted landscape. But just as my physical senses were fading, my consciousness felt a sudden, exhilarating liberation. It was like shedding a heavy, ill-fitting coat. One moment I was Jacob, an 18-year-old in a car. The next I was pure thought, pure awareness, floating in an ethereal state of absolute weightlessness. I found myself hovering, a silent observer in a space that felt both familiar and utterly alien. Below me I could see the garage, the car, and within it, my own body. It looked lifeless, a hollow shell. It was a chilling and surreal sight to see myself from a perspective that shouldn't have been possible. Then I heard a sound, not with my ears, but with an inner sense. My mom was there, her hysterical sobs piercing the silence of the garage. She was trying to open the car door, pulling at my body, but it was too heavy, too inert. I watched her race back inside to call for help. Her grief was a tangible force that I could feel, but not touch. This was my first true moment of profound regret, a sharp pang of pain that had nothing to do with my body, but with the suffering I had caused. Before I could fully process this scene, the world around me began to shift. My consciousness, my soul, was no longer hovering. It began a rapid, forceful descent, like being pulled down a drain. I was falling through a vast, dark abyss, a void without borders or walls. It felt like an eternity, a 10-minute free fall into nothingness. There was no light, no sound, only the overwhelming, disorienting sensation of speed and an all-consuming darkness. I was utterly alone, yet I was aware of myself as a distinct, whole being, separate from the body I had just left behind.
Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the descent stopped. I was no longer falling, but was instead immobilized in a strange, thick quagmire. It was like being stuck in molasses, a spiritual mud that prevented any movement. I tried to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't respond. I tried to scream, but no sound would come. The fear I had felt on earth was nothing compared to this. It was a primal, gut-wrenching terror, the fear of utter powerlessness in the face of an unknown and terrifying fate. It was in this moment of absolute despair that I saw it. A light began to approach me from the right side of my peripheral vision. It wasn't just bright, it was the brightest light I could possibly imagine, so brilliant that I couldn't look directly at it without my entire being feeling overwhelmed. Yet it was not blinding or harsh. Instead, it was warm, comforting, and filled with a feeling of absolute, unconditional love. I felt an undeniable presence within that light, an intelligence and a power that was beyond comprehension. There was no doubt in my soul who it was. It was Jesus. The moment he was about 5 or 6 feet from me, a telepathic conversation began, not with words, but with a torrent of images and understanding that flooded my consciousness. It was my life review. In about 10 seconds, my entire 18 years flashed before me, not as a film, but as a total experience. I felt the feelings of others I had hurt, the disappointment of my parents, the quiet moments of my self-obsession. There was no accusation, no harsh judgment from the light itself. The overwhelming shame I felt came from within, a deep, painful recognition of my own selfishness and the pain I had inflicted. In that moment, I understood everything about myself, every failure, every flawed thought. After the life review, he moved slightly to his left, and a terrifying chasm opened up between us. From its depths, I heard a million voices crying out in agony, a chorus of despair and suffering that was almost unbearable to listen to, and with it, a hideous, mocking laughter that was pure evil. The smell that rose from the chasm was the most sickening thing I have ever experienced, a pungent, nauseating stench of rotting flesh, of spiritual decay. It was the antithesis of everything the light was, a place of pure, unadulterated torment. Then, the telepathic voice of the light returned, presenting a choice with perfect clarity. "You have created this experience through your actions," the voice resonated in my soul's ears. "You can either stay at the gates of this place until Judgment Day, or you can return to your life in a painful and disfigured form." The gravity of the choice was absolute. I was staring into the abyss, and the path back to life seemed equally daunting. As I contemplated my options, a new feeling washed over me. It was a sensation of profound sickness, of both pain and embarrassment, so intense it was physically visceral. I instantly knew that this was the feeling, the reality of what it would be like to return to my body. It was a preview of the hardships I would face, the disfigured state I was being offered as my only way out. But even with that sickening sensation, even with the promise of a life of struggle, I knew my choice. It was the only choice. And in that moment, my soul made its decision.
Returning to my body wasn't a gentle awakening. It was an abrupt, violent splash back into reality. The peaceful nothingness was torn away, replaced by the crushing weight of bone and blood. My soul had made its choice, and now my body was paying the price. The decision was made in an instant. The moment I felt that painful premonition of my new reality, I knew. I chose life, even with its promised pain. And just as quickly as I had been pulled down, I began a swift upward ascent. The dark abyss was replaced by a familiar yet distant feeling of warmth. It was like diving into a pool of tepid water after being in the cold for too long. A shock to the system, a sudden, all-encompassing sensation. The spiritual form I inhabited was pulled into a singularity, compressed and contained, before being slammed back into the crude, heavy confines of flesh and bone. The sensation was not gentle. It was a jolt, a crash. My first conscious thought was of pain. It was a dull, throbbing ache that permeated every cell of my body. The lightness of the void was gone, replaced by the unbearable heaviness. My chest felt like it was filled with lead. My limbs were sluggish and unresponsive, and a nauseating wave of disorientation washed over me. I tried to open my eyes, but the effort was immense, like trying to lift a boulder. When I finally managed to pry them open, the world was a blurry clinical white. The air was sterile and smelled of antiseptic. I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by the beeping of machines. 4 days had passed since I had closed that garage door. 4 days of life, in which I was somewhere else entirely. My mind was a chaotic storm, One moment I was remembering the profound love of the light, the agonizing screams of the chasm, and the sheer terror of being given an impossible choice. The next, I was grappling with the harsh, undeniable reality of my physical body. The contrast was a slap in the face. The otherworldly experience was so vivid, so real, that the hospital room felt like a dream, a flimsy, fragile lie. I was filled with a deep sense of loss. The peace I had felt in the presence of the light, that absolute clarity of purpose, was gone. It had been replaced by a gnawing emptiness and a body that felt alien and broken. When the doctors came in, their faces were a mixture of surprise and professional detachment. I was a medical marvel, a statistic that had defied the odds. They spoke in hushed, technical tones, running scans and tests. They couldn't explain the damage to my brain, a subtle but significant injury that would now be a permanent part of me, the Parkinson's-like syndrome that had been foretold. My family's reaction was a mix of overwhelming relief and palpable fear. My mom held my hand, tears streaming down her face, but she looked at me differently. My dad's eyes were filled with a quiet, terrified awe. They knew I had been gone for 4 days. They knew something had changed, but they couldn't possibly comprehend the scope of it. How could I explain it? The very words felt inadequate. I didn't share my experience with anyone immediately. How could I? I was a boy who just days before had been apathetic about faith. Now I was carrying a secret so immense, so sacred and horrifying, that it felt like an entire universe was contained within me. The doctors would have called it a hallucination, a side effect of oxygen deprivation. My family would have been scared. I was afraid they would see me as insane. So I kept it all to myself, a silent internal echo of a world beyond this one. The conversations, the chasm, the light, they all became my own private reality, a profound, undeniable truth that no one else could possibly understand. The journey back to life was just beginning, and it was a road I knew I would have to walk alone.
My obsession with my complexion vanished, completely replaced by the daily struggle with a body that was failing me. The illness wasn't a punishment, it was a paradoxical gift, the only thing that could make me fight for my life instead of trying to end it. The boy who went into that garage on October 31st, 1988, never came back out. The person who woke up in that hospital bed was someone entirely new, built from the remnants of my old self and the terrifying truths of a world beyond this one. The most dramatic change was the one that had been the cause of my attempted suicide in the first place. My obsession with my complexion was gone. The years of anxiety, the hours spent in front of the mirror, the self-loathing, all of it just disappeared. It was like a fever breaking. In its place was a new, far more immediate and visceral concern, a body that had been permanently damaged. The doctors eventually diagnosed it as a Parkinson's-like syndrome, an echo of the life I had been promised. My former torment had been a mental prison. My new one was a physical one, a constant, unrelenting challenge that forced me to live in the present. My entire worldview was shattered and rebuilt. Before, I was an atheist of convenience, someone who saw death as a simple cessation of existence. Now I knew with an absolute certainty that there was a spiritual world, that our souls are real, and that there is a divine presence of overwhelming love. I was a born-again believer, not because of a book or a sermon, but because of a face-to-face encounter with the source of all light. The fear of death that had once propelled me to end my life was now gone. I had been there, on the precipice of oblivion, and what I found was not nothingness, but a terrifying choice and a profound love. This new understanding gave me a resilience I had never known. The physical pain was a constant, daily reminder of my choice, a brutal echo of the life I had chosen, but it was also a shield. It was something tangible to fight against, something that kept me from sinking back into the mental quicksand of my old life.
My mission became a simple one: to live. The light had given me a new purpose: to struggle, The Parkinson's-like syndrome was a constant, humbling force. I had to learn to manage a body that was no longer my own. The tremors, the stiffness, the slow, agonizing progression of the disease, it all demanded my full attention. It forced me to be present, to fight for every small victory. I wasn't just surviving, I was persevering. And in that perseverance, I found a strange kind of peace. Later in life, as I became more comfortable with my story, I began to share it. I found a community in the church where my experience was not met with skepticism, but with warmth and acceptance. I realized my story could offer a different perspective, a tangible proof for those who struggled with doubt. But the journey wasn't easy. The years have passed, and the Parkinson's has taken its toll, and my body is now riddled with arthritis. And despite the profound peace I found in the light, the spirit of suicide still haunts me, a whisper in the quiet moments. It's a paradox that has tormented me for decades. The overwhelming love and peace I felt in his presence were so powerful that I've tried to kill myself 3 more times since my wedding in 1999. Not out of despair, but out of a desperate, foolish longing to return to that presence. The shame of those attempts is a heavy burden, a stark reminder of the weakness of the human spirit. Yet I am still here. I am still fighting. I have struggled with the spirit of suicide most days since then, but I guess I'm immortal or something, so I will have to wait until he calls me back home. And that brings me to the final lesson, the message I want to leave you with. My life has been defined by struggle, first with the torment of my own making, and then with the torment I was given. But the second one, the one that broke my body, was the one that saved my soul. It forced me to fight, to endure, to choose life even when it was painful. It was a gift in disguise, a constant reminder of the profound love I was offered and the horror I narrowly avoided. So don't fear the struggle. Don't fear the pain. Sometimes the greatest challenges we face are not punishments, but the only way we can be truly saved from ourselves. We are here for a reason, and every day is a choice to fight, a choice to love, and a choice to wait to be called home.